It wasn't just another royal engagement, it was a coronation in disguise. The cameras were told to stay still, the guests to remain silent. Even the air within the great hall seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Princess Anne, the woman who had lived her entire life in service without seeking glory, stepped forward with a calm that masked years of burden. Every step echoed with a strange finality, the sound of an era ending and another quietly beginning. Her hand, steady yet trembling with age, held not a crown of gold, but one of legacy. And when she turned to Catherine, the world felt the shift before it was spoken. This wasn't duty. This was destiny sculpted in silence, delivered in grace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. No one knew why the ceremony felt different, why Anne's expression carried sorrow rather than pride. The press had been told it was a tribute, a farewell to her years of service. Yet every word she spoke dripped with symbolism, every gesture thick with meaning that eluded even the most seasoned royal correspondents. Her voice trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of history itself. She didn't look to the king, nor to Camilla, nor even to William. Her gaze was fixed solely on Catherine, calm, composed, radiant yet restrained. It was as though Anne saw in her not a future queen, but something greater, the soul of a monarchy gasping for direction. The audience, hand-picked and heavily vetted, sat motionless. Even the photographers had been instructed to hold back flashes. Behind veiled curtains, shadowed silhouettes watched familiar outlines that didn't wish to be seen yet refused to miss the moment. Some said they saw the king's outline, still and unreadable. Others swore they recognized William, standing in the dim light, his eyes locked on his wife with an emotion no one could name. But the truth was simpler. They were all witnessing a transfer of power that could never be officially declared. Anne's speech began with grace, a reflection on duty, service, and endurance. But her tone grew heavier, her pauses longer. The words twisted into something unspoken yet undeniable. "For every crown," she said softly, "there must be a heart that beats for more than power, a voice that steadies when all others waver." Her gaze turned to Catherine as she lifted the family's ceremonial circlet, the same she had worn decades ago at her first public investiture. And then, with deliberate solemnity, she lowered it toward Catherine's bowed head. The audience gasped not from surprise, but from the shock of witnessing what felt forbidden. Cameras clicked before guards swiftly intervened, and the footage was immediately classified. For a fleeting second, Catherine's eyes glistened, and her lips parted in what might have been disbelief or acceptance. The moment wasn't long, but it was eternal, the silent coronation of a woman chosen not by title but by trust. And then Anne spoke the words that would later echo through palace corridors. "To you, Catherine, I entrust the family's crown of honor." A sentence simple in sound, yet seismic in meaning. The crowd exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for centuries. It was a declaration of lineage, of authority and of faith in a future Anne knew she would not see. No applause followed. Only the eerie stillness of realization that something irreversible had occurred. Reporters would later call it the ceremony that stopped time, a phrase whispered with reverence and fear alike, because for the first time in decades, the monarchy had not followed protocol, it had followed instinct. And as Anne's hand dropped from Catherine's shoulder, her face softened with relief. The torch had been passed not through decree, but through devotion. Yet beneath that composure lay a truth no one could deny. This was not a farewell, but a reckoning. But what led Princess Anne, the unshakable pillar of duty, to pass her life's devotion into Catherine's hands? The answer began long before the ceremony, in the cracks of a monarchy struggling to survive itself. For decades, Princess Anne was the royal family's silent backbone, never complaining, never faltering. Through every scandal, every whispered feud, every changing monarchical season, she stood firm, her composure unbroken even as the foundations around her began to tremble. But behind that unwavering discipline lay something deeper, a quiet exhaustion that few ever saw. Those who truly knew her said there were nights she sat alone by the fire, the weight of the crown pressing on her shoulders, though it was never hers to wear. She wasn't just serving the monarchy, she was holding it together, stitching its fraying seams in silence while others wore its glory. And yet, even Anne, the eternal symbol of endurance, began to see the cracks widening beyond repair. It wasn't power that troubled her, it was chaos. The new generation, born into privilege but baptized in division, seemed restless, uncertain, and at times dangerously unprepared. William was burdened by expectation. Harry had abandoned his post, and Catherine, the one who stood between tradition and change, was being pulled in opposite directions. Anne watched them all with a mixture of pride and fear, sensing the inevitable shift, the kind of transition that could either preserve the monarchy's dignity or shatter its illusion entirely. She knew that the family no longer understood the language of loyalty as she did. Service had become performance, and performance had replaced purpose. So, quietly and methodically, Anne began to write. Not speeches, not memos, letters, private notes sealed by hand, written in the kind of careful script that spoke of duty and deliberation. But the letters weren't addressed to the king, nor to his heirs. They were addressed to Catherine, to the woman she once dismissed as a dutiful figurehead, but had come to see as something far greater. "You are the only one who listens without seeking power." One of those letters read a phrase later repeated in hushed tones among palace aides who never forgot it. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. Anne saw in Catherine the qualities that had long vanished from royal corridors. Humility, quiet strength, and a devotion that wasn't tied to ambition. Those letters became Anne's confession, her legacy in ink. Between every line hid fragments of warning coded truths about the family's fractures, hints about decisions that had already been made but never spoken aloud. They were lessons disguised as stories, advice cloaked as affection, and somewhere among them, Anne had written of her final duty, though no one knew then what she meant. Only Catherine, upon reading, felt the chill of prophecy as if Anne was preparing her not for a role, but for an inheritance of responsibility that could never be publicly named. Anne's burden wasn't that of power, it was that of foresight. She saw what others refused to see. A monarchy divided by ego, threatened not by outsiders but by those within. She watched Charles's reign tighten and fracture under the weight of modern scrutiny, and she knew that when the crown could no longer command respect, it would need a heart to hold it together. The institution would survive only if someone carried its emotional truth. That realization haunted her. And so, Anne began to plan her exit, not a retirement of title, but a passing of trust. Those closest to her described a subtle change in the final years. Her appearances became fewer, her tone softer, her speeches tinged with something almost farewell-like. But it wasn't defeat that shaped her silence, it was resolve. She knew her time as the monarchy's shield was ending, and someone else had to take the mantle of endurance. She had chosen Catherine long before the world would ever understand why. The letters were her final act of rebellion and devotion, intertwined a bridge from an era of obedience to one of quiet authority. And though no one outside their private circle would ever read them, their impact was already unfolding in the choices Catherine made, in the strength she would soon have to summon. But the weight Anne carried didn't come from the crown. It came from the crumbling bonds around it, and Catherine was about to be tested in ways no queen ever had. When Anne began her quiet retreat, the palace was already divided. King Charles believed in order, Camilla believed in influence. But Anne, she believed in survival, and she knew neither could protect the monarchy from itself. Behind closed doors, power was shifting. Every handshake, every luncheon, every press briefing carried a hidden message. The monarchy, so outwardly composed, had become a battlefield of wills, and while the king sought to modernize the crown, the queen sought to shape its perception, leaving Anne to fight for something far more fragile, its soul. Charles envisioned a monarchy reborn leaner, streamlined, and pragmatic. He wanted fewer royals on the payroll, fewer traditions that spoke of outdated grandeur. To him, the future was about relevance, but Anne saw the danger in that. Stripping away ceremony, she believed, meant stripping away reverence. The monarchy's strength wasn't efficiency, it was endurance. And to Anne, endurance required roots, not reinvention. Her disagreements with her brother were quiet but relentless, the kind that left unspoken tension hanging in every meeting. Where Charles saw progress, Anne saw erosion. Where he sought control, she foresaw collapse. Then came Camilla, graceful, charming, and increasingly influential. What began as soft diplomacy turned into deliberate shaping of royal image. Her network grew wider. Her circle of advisors began to outnumber the king's. Invitations shifted, patronages redirected. Slowly, the tone of royal affairs began to carry her signature. She wasn't just queen consort, she was the monarchy's new voice in social perception. And that terrified Anne. For years she had guarded the institution's heart, its moral compass. But Camilla, though effective, played by modern rules that favoured power over principle. Caught between these two worlds was Catherine, poised, diplomatic, but increasingly uneasy. She admired Charles's reformist vision, but instinctively understood Anne's warnings. And in that quiet understanding, Anne saw her. A listener, not a schemer. A bridge, not a threat. So Anne did what no one expected. She began mentoring Catherine in private. The lessons were subtle, almost invisible to outsiders. They met not in grandeur but in whispers, behind locked doors, during quiet engagements that seemed routine but carried the weight of something greater. Anne taught her what it meant to rule without. Authority to command through presence, not power. It was the education of a matriarch in waiting. But the palace walls have ears. Rumours began to swirl of Anne grooming Catherine, of letters exchanged that never passed through official channels. Charles's aides intercepted fragments of correspondence filled with cryptic phrasing. The matriarch must rise when the throne begins to falter. Within weeks, an internal document leaked a confidential memo labelled Anne's Matriarch Project. It was said to outline her quiet plan for ensuring the monarchy's continuity through female stewardship, a move that challenged the king's traditional hierarchy. The memo was dismissed as gossip, yet it spread through every department of the palace like wildfire. And the most telling part? No one ever denied its existence. Charles grew wary, Camilla defensive, and Catherine, the supposed shadow matriarch, was forced to walk a line so thin that one misstep could end her royal life. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every word she spoke measured against loyalties she never pledged. Yet through it all, Anne remained calm, offering neither denial nor defense. She had seen this pattern before, kings and queens locked in rivalry, while the true threats waited in silence. To Anne, Catherine wasn't a rival to power, she was the key to preserving it. The invisible war deepened, conversations turned colder, schedules rearranged to separate certain names from others. Within the palace, unity became theatre, not truth. But through every division, Catherine carried Anne's words like a compass. Survival isn't about dominance, it's about endurance. When they fight for control, you fight for continuity. And so, while Charles and Camilla wrestled for influence, Catherine quietly learned the art of invisible authority, the kind that didn't need a title to rule hearts. What Anne had started in secrecy was becoming the monarchy's unspoken lifeline. If Anne had, he's been preparing Catherine in secret, it meant only one thing. She anticipated the storm before anyone else could see it forming. While the press obsessed over Catherine's grace, her gowns, and her seemingly effortless composure, few realized what was truly unfolding behind the heavy palace doors. Beneath the calm veneer of photo calls and handshakes, a secret education was taking place, one that had nothing to do with glamour and everything to do with survival. Princess Anne had been preparing her, quietly, meticulously, for years. But it wasn't training for ceremonial appearances or public adoration. It was something deeper, an inheritance of discipline, silence, and strength. Anne was not shaping a duchess, she was forging a matriarch. And Catherine, unaware of the magnitude of her own transformation, was slowly being positioned for a destiny no royal title could ever fully define. Their lessons began subtly, almost invisibly. Anne's invitations would arrive without fanfare quiet. Lunches at the estate, private walks at Balmoral, late-night phone calls that lasted for hours. Each meeting carried purpose disguised as conversation. Anne would speak of royal history not as nostalgia, but as strategy, what to say when one's heart disagreed, how to win loyalty without demanding it, how to lead without ever appearing to lead. It was what she called the tapestry of continuity, a philosophy that the monarchy must never appear shaken, even when it's crumbling within. Every generation, she told Catherine, must weave new strength into that tapestry or risk watching it unravel. Anne's lessons went beyond words. She would assign tasks designed to test Catherine's resolve. Small decisions on charity matters that subtly affected royal hierarchy, requests to mediate between conflicting aides, instructions to manage tension without confrontation. These weren't random, they were rehearsals for leadership. Each was a carefully measured challenge, teaching her to carry pressure with composure and to speak power through restraint. In silence, Anne told her once, the monarchy survives its storms. Catherine listened, absorbing the rhythm of Anne's wisdom, the code behind her calm. But not everyone was blind to this growing alliance. William, once comforted by his wife's closeness with his aunt, began to sense something deeper, something he didn't fully understand. He noticed Catherine's language changing. Her responses became deliberate, her patience sharper. She began navigating palace politics with quiet precision, diffusing situations before they erupted, calming courtiers who had long stopped trusting the hierarchy above them. William admired it, but feared it too, because in Catherine's evolving confidence, he saw Anne's imprint, and with it, the subtle suggestion that his wife was being moulded for a power even he hadn't been offered. Still, Catherine never sought it. At first, she resisted Anne's guidance, unsure of the weight she was being asked to carry. She didn't see herself as a matriarch or an architect of legacy. She only wanted to protect her family. But Anne, with that unyielding voice of quiet command, reminded her that protecting a family and preserving a dynasty were the same fight. Slowly, Catherine accepted the truth she had tried to deny. That love within the monarchy was fragile, but duty was eternal. As Anne's health began to falter and her appearances grew fewer, Catherine's role deepened. The Queen's increasing absence left a vacuum that the public couldn't yet sense, but Anne could. It was in that silence, when official leadership waned, that Catherine's preparation reached its most crucial phase. Decisions once filtered through senior courtiers began landing on her desk. Her words carried new weight in meetings she hadn't been invited to attend. Her presence, once symbolic, became necessary. The palace had begun turning to her instinctively, not out of command, but out of trust. And trust, in the monarchy, was the rarest form of power. What Anne had created in private was beginning to shape the monarchy in public. Catherine had become the quiet axis around which chaos began to settle. And though she never spoke of it, she knew Anne's lessons were no longer practice, they were prophecy. The monarchy was shifting, and she was standing in the center of its storm without even realizing the crown had already been placed upon her, not by law, but by legacy. But Anne's prophecy wasn't about guidance, it was about preservation. And when tragedy struck, the prophecy began to unfold with ruthless precision. The world saw it as a health scare, nothing more. A brief hospitalization, a cautious statement from the palace, a reassuring photograph released to the press. But inside those gilded walls, it was chaos disguised as composure. King Charles's sudden illness tore through the fragile balance the family had been clinging to. The monarch, who prided himself on control, was suddenly absent, and the vacuum he left behind was more dangerous than any diagnosis. Without his steady, if controversial, hand on the reins, the monarchy found itself leaderless, and in the royal household, leadership isn't requested, it's seized. Camilla stepped forward first. She had been preparing for this moment for years, though no one dared say it aloud. Her instinct was to act, to project confidence, to keep the machinery moving. But in doing so, she moved too fast, signing off on public appearances that felt tone-deaf, enforcing protocols that alienated long-time courtiers, and reorganizing engagements in a way that seemed to sideline certain family members. Within days, murmurs turned into open discontent. Senior aides privately described her leadership as reckless, a term never before associated with her. The press, ever watchful, began to pick up the scent of division. Headlines speculated, critics stirred, and old wounds within the family reopened. What had begun as a medical emergency was now a constitutional crisis of confidence. Anne, confined to her residence due to frail health, watched it all unfold like a prophecy coming true. She had seen this before, the quiet implosions that start with pride and end in public humiliation. But this time, she refused to let the family's unraveling define its legacy. In her weakened state, she made one final, decisive call. "Summon Catherine," she ordered through her private secretary. The words carried the weight of destiny. This wasn't about rank or bloodline, it was about steadiness. Anne knew Catherine's preparation was complete, and now, the moment she had been groomed for had arrived. When Catherine stepped into the chaos, her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. She didn't demand authority, she embodied it. While Camilla focused on appearances, Catherine focused on repair. She quietly reached out to key courtiers, reinstating traditional protocols that had been abandoned in haste. She counseled William to remain calm, urging him not to challenge decisions publicly but to let unity appear unbroken. In meetings with palace staff, she spoke with precision, never accusatory, always measured. Her tone reminded them not of a queen in waiting, but of a monarch in spirit. It was Anne's training, word for word, coming to life. The transformation was immediate. Within a week, the tone of the media changed. Where once there was uncertainty, now there was admiration. Catherine the calm amid crisis, one paper declared. Others called her the stabilizing heart of a shaken monarchy. Even within the palace, hardened officials began to look to her for guidance. It was subtle, but undeniable. Influence had shifted. What had been Anne's quiet design had now become Catherine's visible reality. And while Camilla remained outwardly dignified, she could feel the tide turning not in anger, but in inevitability. The monarchy, by instinct or by fate, had found its moral center again. Anne received word of Catherine's success days later. She read the briefing in silence, her face unreadable to those around her. But within her heart, she felt something close to relief. Her final test had been passed. Catherine had stood where others might have fallen, not by power, but by purpose. The dynasty she had protected her entire life now had a new guardian, one molded not in ambition, but in resilience. And so, under the guise of a farewell ceremony, Anne orchestrated a coronation no one dared to name until the moment her hand touched Catherine's crown. It happened in silence, no trumpets, no grand procession, only two women, one legacy. The palace hall was still, the air heavy with history that seemed to breathe through its walls. As Princess Anne raised the ceremonial circlet, the moment stretched beyond ceremony and into destiny. Catherine's eyes glistened not with triumph, but with quiet fear, because she knew this wasn't just a gesture. It was a transfer of spirit, a private coronation of the heart. She wasn't being honored, she was being entrusted. And in that stillness, Anne's trembling hands placed upon her something far heavier than gold, the weight of the family's survival. Anne spoke softly, her voice steady but layered with emotion that decades of restraint could no longer hide. "To serve," she began, "is to surrender. To lead, one must listen to the silence between words, to the cries behind the duty." The words sounded simple, but they mirrored the vows of a true coronation, a promise to stand, not above, but within the institution that defines and devours those who serve it. Catherine nodded, her expression serene, but inside, her heart thundered. The realization struck her. This was no mere tribute. This was succession, hidden in plain sight. The matriarch's mantle had been passed, not through royal decree, but through faith and understanding. Catherine did not speak. She couldn't. Her acceptance was silent, a nod, a single tear she fought to restrain. It wasn't weakness. It was the moment every lesson, every letter, every word Anne had ever whispered to her crystallized into one truth. She was no longer simply the wife of the heir. She was the monarchy's moral center, the anchor in a sea that would never stop shifting. From that moment on, even the way the staff addressed her changed, subtly, respectfully. The air itself seemed to bend differently when she entered a room. But the world outside that sacred circle was restless. The few journalists present sensed something monumental had occurred, though none could define it. The photos captured the gesture, but not its meaning. Anne lowering the circlet. Catherine's bowed head, the intensity of the silence around them. Was it symbolic? Ceremonial? Or something far greater? The palace offered no explanation. Every inquiry was met with a calm, rehearsed denial. Honor. Yet, no one believed that. The ambiguity became fuel for speculation. Headlines spread across continents. Princess Anne's mysterious gesture. Did the monarchy crown its future? The Queen's absence did not go unnoticed. For the first time in decades, a royal event of such significance took place without her presence, and that silence spoke louder than any statement could. Commentators debated her omission. Was it approval cloaked in distance or dissent wrapped in discretion? No one knew. But those within the palace walls understood the truth. The Queen's absence was Anne's permission slip. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that one era was fading, and another had already begun. Behind closed doors, advisors scrambled to control the narrative. Was Catherine now a co-leader in waiting? Was Anne's gesture a breach of protocol? The confusion only made the moment more powerful, because what was meant to remain private had already escaped into public consciousness, transforming into something that neither the king nor his courtiers could undo. It was a coronation without ceremony, a succession without declaration, and everyone felt it. Anne, watching Catherine's steady composure amid the whirlwind of speculation, finally understood what she had hoped for all along: the strength to endure without explanation, the grace to lead without command. In Catherine, she saw the reflection of everything she had tried to preserve: the monarchy's quiet heart beating beneath centuries of noise. And as she turned away, her face softened with both relief and melancholy. She had done her part. Her duty was complete. But the ceremony wasn't an ending, it was a warning. Because where there is new power, there are always shadows waiting to reclaim it. Within hours, the whispers began. Matriarch Catherine, Anne's chosen heir, the king's silence. The words moved through the palace like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. Every corridor in Buckingham Palace hummed with speculation. Every conversation lowered its tone the moment her name was mentioned. The ceremony that had been meant to symbolize continuity was now being dissected as a coup in disguise. No one knew whether Catherine had been crowned or cornered, but one thing was certain: nothing inside those walls would ever be the same again. Loyalty, once the lifeblood of the institution, fractured overnight. The staff split into factions. On one side were Anne's loyalists, the old guard, who believed in discipline, hierarchy, and moral strength. They saw Catherine as the natural successor to Anne's quiet empire of influence. On the other were Camilla's allies, social tacticians who understood that image was power, and Catherine's growing public halo was a direct threat to their control. Between them stood a monarchy unraveling under its own secrecy. The tension wasn't loud, it was lethal. William, too, found himself trapped in the crossfire. He admired his wife's grace and her ability to unite where others divided, but beneath his admiration lurked unease. The press had begun calling her the woman who steadied the crown. Some headlines even went further, hinting at a female-led monarchy, a phrase that both electrified and terrified the institution. William wondered whether Anne's mentorship had gone too far, whether his wife had inherited not just the matriarch's wisdom, but her will to lead. He loved her, but he also feared what her rising power meant for his future role. Then came the leak. Late-night emails circulated among palace officials, referencing what one aide called a power shift in royal command. Another described Catherine's growing influence over public communication strategies and internal briefings, decisions usually reserved for senior royal advisors. The leak spread beyond the palace within hours. Newspapers splashed the words "Palace in Flux" across their front pages. Insiders whispered that Catherine had quietly taken the reins of public trust, whether anyone had granted her permission or not. When Charles recovered and returned to public life, the tension became visible even in photographs. His interactions with Catherine, once warm and paternal, grew measured, polite, but distant. The king, who valued order above all else, now faced an uncomfortable reality. The public adored the woman who represented the very change he feared. Camilla, sensing the threat, moved quickly to reassert control, arranging engagements that placed her beside the king at every major event. But the damage had already been done. The image of Catherine standing beside Anne, calm, dignified, unshaken, had imprinted itself on the nation's consciousness. Public sentiment was undeniable. Polls soared in Catherine's favour. Commentators praised her as the quiet strength behind the crown, while others hailed her as the future of the monarchy. Outside the palace gates, crowds carried banners bearing her name. What began as a symbolic act of succession had turned into a public coronation of trust. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was now weighed not as that of a princess, but as that of a ruler in waiting. Inside the palace, however, admiration twisted into anxiety. Senior courtiers feared that Catherine's rise, however unintentional, had created an imbalance that no one knew how to manage. They worried that the monarchy's story, once tightly controlled, had slipped into the hands of the public. For the first time, the crown's narrative wasn't being written within the palace, but by those outside its walls. Catherine's silence only deepened the mystery. She neither confirmed nor denied her new role, allowing the myth of the Matriarch to grow on its own. And so the monarchy, once bound by protocol, now stood at a crossroads pulled between two centres of power, the old and the inevitable new. Catherine hadn't sought the crown that Anne placed upon her, but destiny had a way of demanding what others feared to embrace. And as the monarchy wrestled with its new balance of power, Catherine's next move would decide whether she'd become the saviour of the crown or its silent undoing. She didn't speak from a balcony or deliver a speech. Her first command came quietly, in a letter sent to every royal household. "We must stand as one." 6 words. Simple, elegant, unthreatening, yet behind them lay the single most transformative act the monarchy had witnessed in decades. Beneath its language of unity was a reorganization of power so subtle, so deliberate, that few realized what had happened until it was already done. Within weeks, the palace machinery began to shift. Meetings were rescheduled, departments were restructured, old hierarchies dissolved without announcement. And in the center of this silent revolution stood Catherine, the woman who had once been underestimated as simply dutiful, now stepping into Anne's shadow, not as an heir, but as her successor in spirit. Her first move was to bring order to the chaos Anne had long warned her about. The palace, bloated with overlapping influence, had been riddled with quiet infighting and divided loyalties. Catherine began by dismantling what she called the noise. Courtiers who thrived on gossip and alignment with power found themselves dismissed or reassigned. Their replacements were carefully chosen not for their obedience, but for their discretion. Communication channels, once fragmented between competing offices, were unified under a single directive: clarity, purpose, loyalty. It wasn't a purge of rebellion, it was the restoration of discipline. Yet to those who had benefited from confusion and rivalry, it felt like a coup executed with velvet precision. Camilla's allies were the first to feel the chill. For years, her circle had shaped narratives, leaking favoured stories to friendly journalists and steering attention in subtle ways. But Catherine's quiet intervention cut those threads. Media leaks slowed, internal documents were tracked, and staff who once operated without oversight found their access revoked. When questioned by senior aides about these sudden changes, Catherine's answer was measured but firm. Order begins with honesty. It was a phrase that would become emblematic of her new rule, one that demanded integrity without spectacle. Then came the act that made the world take notice. Her first solo engagement, unaccompanied by William, the king, or the queen consort. It was a visit of compassion on the surface, but its message was unmistakable. Catherine was no longer an extension of someone else's authority. She was her own. Cameras captured her quiet confidence, the calm steadiness in her tone, the way she addressed issues of unity and service without once invoking hierarchy. The press, hungry for symbolism, gave her a new title, The Crown's True Compass. It was more than a nickname, it was a declaration. Behind the headlines, a far more personal moment unfolded. Anne requested a private meeting. The two women sat together for hours, no advisors, no aides, no pretense. Those who caught glimpses of them afterward said Catherine's eyes were red but resolute. Whatever words passed between them that day marked the true completion of Anne's prophecy. The torch had been passed, not through ceremony, but through mutual understanding between two women bound not by rank, but by endurance. Anne saw in her protégée the proof that her lifelong defence of the monarchy had not been in vain. Catherine, for her part, carried both gratitude and grief. She understood now that leadership was not a reward, it was a weight. When Anne took her final step back from public life, there were no statements, no farewells. She disappeared as she had lived dutifully, without spectacle. Catherine's next move was to ensure her mentor's legacy was honoured, not in words, but in actions. She continued Anne's philosophy of quiet strength, steering the monarchy away from noise and towards stability. But even as she did, a new burden settled upon her, the knowledge that from now on, every decision, every silence, every misstep would define not just her legacy, but the future Anne had entrusted to her. But for Anne, it wasn't farewell, it was faith. She had handed Catherine the future, and now, the family's survival depended on her ability to wield it. As the palace gates reopened to the world, Catherine stood alone not as queen, but as something far more enduring. Behind her, Anne's era had ended with the grace of a woman who knew her purpose was complete. Before her stretched a fractured monarchy desperate for healing. The matriarch's crown that now rested upon Catherine's spirit was invisible to the eye, but impossible to ignore. The people sensed it. The palace felt it. Even those who once doubted her now bowed to the quiet power that had no official title, no ceremony, no proclamation. And as Anne's final bow faded into silence, the truth settled over the kingdom like a revelation. The throne may belong to kings, but the monarchy survives through its queens. Catherine's rise was not loud, not forced. It was steady, the kind of strength that no decree could manufacture. Her first months as the new matriarch unfolded like a delicate balancing act between reverence and renewal. She reintroduced formality where chaos had crept in, but replaced rigidity with warmth. The image of the royal family began to change under her careful watch, no longer a dynasty clinging to old power, but one rediscovering its humanity. Her voice, calm yet unwavering, became the monarchy's anchor in a world that had grown skeptical of crowns and titles. She wasn't leading through authority, but through authenticity, a lesson Anne had carved into her heart long before the world took notice. Anne's retirement had been expected, but its execution was flawless. One morning, a quiet statement was released. Her Royal Highness Princess Anne will withdraw from public duties indefinitely. There was no press conference, no farewell event, just silence, as if she had faded into the history she once protected. Those closest to her said she left behind a sealed letter addressed only to Catherine, marked, "For when silence becomes heavier than duty." Its contents were never revealed, but in the months that followed, Catherine's demeanour deepened, her calm became more introspective, her decisions more measured. It was as though Anne's final lesson had reached her beyond words. Under Catherine's stewardship, the monarchy found its footing again. Protocols softened. Charity work expanded beyond formality into personal connection. For the first time in years, the royal image wasn't defined by scandal or speculation, but by stability. The press, once divided in their loyalties, began to converge on one narrative: Catherine, the new matriarch, of the crown. The phrase trended globally. Analysts called her the heart of the house, while others compared her influence to monarchs of centuries past, who rebuilt empires not through force, but through empathy. Even the king, once wary of her growing shadow, began to rely on her instinct. She had become what Anne envisioned, the quiet ruler behind the royal stage, holding it all together without ever demanding credit. And yet, beneath the triumph, there lingered a haunting truth. Power, no matter how gently worn, carries a cost. Catherine often found herself revisiting Anne's words, realizing that leadership was not measured in applause, but in sacrifice. She saw it in William's weary eyes, in the fragile reconciliation between family members, in the unspoken burden of being the moral center in a house built on hierarchy. The more she succeeded, the heavier the silence around her grew. Forever in the shadows of those you protect. The world called it a new dawn, the matriarch era. A chapter defined not by royal edicts, but by emotional authority, resilience, and quiet command. But even as the sunlight returned to the monarchy's image, storm clouds gathered just beyond sight. The press, ever hungry, began to speculate about succession, about generational divides, about the shifting loyalties that inevitably follow power. The same whispers that once surrounded Anne were returning, only now they circled Catherine. Still, she stood firm, just as Anne had taught her, with grace, with restraint, with the calm of a woman who understood that crowns may glitter, but true power is worn in silence. And so began a new reign, not of kings, but of women who kept the monarchy alive when the crown itself had begun to falter.